Welcome to the Executive Hustle podcast, where I am your host, Kirsten Urich, speaker, author, retired CEO, mother of four, and recovering workaholic. Explore with Central Pennsylvania local executives what it takes to lead well, live well, and learn well. Understanding that leaders cannot survive, let alone thrive, without a spirit of curiosity, a discipline of accountability, and a disposition for vulnerability. Let's dive in. Welcome, Nick. I am so excited to have you today. Nick is the Executive Vice President of Dawood Engineering, a firm here in the local Harrisburg area. And I am so glad to have you on the podcast today. I've been looking forward to speaking with you specifically around some things about influence and how leaders can use their influence in their position without necessarily relying on, say, your title or your actual position, because that's something that I think resonates with leaders and aspiring leaders. And so I think your story is going to really resonate today. Welcome, Nick.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
So glad to have you. So tell me, before we dive into maybe that story, tell me a little bit about 7-year-old Nick. Did he want to be a bridge engineer?
I think 7-year-old Nick did not know what a bridge engineer was or what bridges were. I think as
Fair.
children, there are so many things that we take for granted, relying on mom and dad to get us around wherever we needed, and just with the expectation that we're going to get from point A to point B completely safe.
Yeah.
I spent a lot of time playing G.I. Joe, as any 7-year-old child of the 80s did. I spent a lot of time outside in tree forts and digging in mud piles and doing all the things that you'd expect kids of the 80s to be doing. But bridges did not cross my mind as a 7-year-old. It wasn't really until high school that
Okay.
I started to have an appreciation of very large bridges. Trip to Toronto with the band, going to Pantages Theater. There were a lot of bridges in that area that I said, this infrastructure is impressive and required for civilization to exist.
Yeah. So Toronto made a big impression.
It did.
Yeah. So how did you get from high school, the band, to doing what you're doing today?
I've had this conversation several times recently. My high school guidance counselor was former military,
Mm-hmm.
and in high school, it's slightly before the age of computers, but we had computers and they were all DOS-based, floppy disk style. You entered all the things that you were good at, and get this printout of the things that my skills would be best suited for. And number one was nuclear engineering. And my guidance counselor, who was this former military guy, said, nuclear engineering is great. You could have a great career in that. I'm sure you'd be successful, but do you like to be would you like to be on a battleship or a submarine? And I'm like, oh, well, I mean, that interestingly, I did apply for the Naval Academy, but did not go there. But I chose that I did not want to be on a ship on the ocean for the majority of my life. Or at least that's what I was scared into believing. So
Yeah.
civil engineering was on that list. It was within the top couple. And looking through colleges, there were a lot of options for civil engineering, and that's what I chose. And my experience with Toronto and the appreciation of infrastructure in the area that I grew up. I grew up in what was called the valley between the Chemung and Susquehanna River in a town called Athens in Bradford County. So we had a lot of bridges. There were a lot of bridges in Pennsylvania. So it was a very good state, I'll say in general, to have to cross a lot of bridges and have that appreciation. Once it was pointed out to you, like, hey, you pretty much need a bridge no matter where you're going in Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
On a daily basis, you probably can cross 15, 20, 30, 50 bridges without even thinking about it.
Isn't that interesting how we can be surrounded by something? And like you said, when you were younger, we don't really think about it. And even as an adult, we might pass over 2, 3 bridges in a day. And how many of us are thinking about, I wonder if this bridge is safe, or who built this bridge? When are they fixing this bridge? I have a bridge near me and it's been out probably 6 to 9 months. I think it's going to be out another year. And you look at all that goes into redoing completely this bridge that's near me. And it's an amazing feat of just both leadership and engineering and I don't even know what because I'm not an engineer at all. So I just tell me everything. What has to go into what you do on a daily basis? What are some of the biggest things that you face?
Well, the engineering process alone can be up to 3 years. So typically the engineering process can be a lot longer
Mm-hmm.
than the actual replacement. And obviously getting from the start to the finish, there is a lot because there are a lot of moving pieces. It's not just the bridge, for
Mm-hmm.
example. There's the environmental aspects of it. And environmental is a huge arena of not just bugs and bunnies, but historic structures and, you know, prehistoric items that you might find in the area.
Sure.
Um, but you have to process or get through that environmental process. And then you start with your survey, you have to find out what's below your surface. So as a leader on a project, you have to develop a schedule that's going to help guide, when you do things, when you need them to keep the project moving
Mm-hmm.
and flowing so you don't have big pauses, right? You need the survey before you can start the line and grade, and you need the line and grade to be able to develop a profile so you can do a hydraulic analysis if it's over water, and you need that analysis to size your opening for the structure. You need the structure to tie back, and it's one of those things where there's a circle and you kind of have to
Right.
chase around that circle and make sure that everybody's on the same page. And that is a big part of, I'll say, leadership in general, is making sure everyone is on the same page. Communication is a big part of that.
Yeah. So you mentioned leadership, mentioned communication. I'm guessing the way you approached a bridge in, say, years one, two, and three of your career is not necessarily how you're approaching a project now, a couple decades into your career. Tell me, what is some of the things that you know now as you are leading the company and still projects, I'm guessing, that you wish you knew then?
Well, I would say, from the project perspective, I think it's real easy for people to compartmentalize. And I
Mm,
think the danger of compartmentalizing is there are definitely things in your arena that will impact other arenas. So making sure, I mentioned before, making sure everyone's on the same page.
mhm,
And one of the things I've talked about with my team recently was having all task leaders be copied on a specific task. So if we have a task for traffic control, for example, so traffic control, how does that impact the bridge if it's a detour, right? It shouldn't impact the bridge, but sometimes it can.
mhm, mhm.
So if I assign a task to the traffic control task leader, copying the other task leaders. So as any issues come up, all of those task leaders then are copied on what those issues might be. And a good example of that would be if the detour is posted. So if it is a load posted road, then we have the conversation of, well, if the road is posted, how is the contractor that's going to do the work get his equipment and materials there? So then we have to start thinking about where else will this impact? If we're going to have to do a pre and post condition route survey, do we need to have a special provision for repairing the road when the contractor is done so he doesn't leave it in a worse condition than he
Right.
found it?
Right. So it sounds like you really default to everyone knowing everything so that if one person is not thinking of something else, it's going to get caught.
Leadership is definitely a team game. Every project is a team game.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I think leaders generally are only as good as the team that they surround themselves with,
Mm,
and that's critically important.
yeah. How have you been influencing the team? I love that you said, the leader is really only as good as the team, because if you're too far out ahead of your team, you're alone, right? And you can't build a bridge as one person. You can't do much of anything as a leader as one person. So I love that you said that. Tell me ways that you're influencing inside your company to improve your teams.
Influence inside the company. I mean, with my team specifically, we have regular meetings.
Hmm.
And in those meetings, we talk about, what is coming up?
Mm,
What are the hot projects of this month? So it helps the team develop priorities. on individual projects, if we have one issue or we find something either in our quality checks or our quality assurance, we typically send that out to the entire team saying, hey, this issue happened, and to prevent it from happening again, these are the details. And the tough thing about engineering or anything in life, right? There are so many items that could occur. So the intent isn't that everyone's going to know everything. That's just
Right. Right.
impossible. But the idea is putting that seed or that idea in somebody's head of, I vaguely recall something about this. Let me do a search, or let me ask somebody like, hey, did we talk about this issue? And it helps to, I feel like people learn best by doing. So just saying, hey, this happened doesn't really lead to them learning,
Mm-hmm.
but it could plant that seed that they will ask a question next time. And then when they do it, they will say, hey, this happened. This happened before, and we need to do it this way. And then the critical piece of that is always the because,
Yeah.
like the
Yeah.
understanding why it needs to happen this way and not a different way.
Yeah. That sounds like a real distinction between a coaching leadership mentality and maybe a command and control. Like you just have to do it this way because I said so, or because this is what the form says, or, that type of scripted method versus, hey, this is a learning model. We're coaching you through it. There's going to be mistakes and that's going to be okay, but we're all going to grow through these. It seems to be a real distinction that you've made inside.
It it is. We had a culture meeting last week, and one of the things that I brought up was I'm not a fan of ever hearing we do it this way because this is the way we've always done it. I
Yes.
don't ever want to hear this is the way we've always done it. I think that's a terrible excuse. I want to hear this is the way we do it because this is the most efficient or most productive or the most economical way. And sometimes those can be at odds. And sometimes you have to pick one or the other. And that would be my job as a leader. But I don't want to hear like this is the way we've done it. There's got to be a reason why we do things a certain way. And it's got to be for, one of those reasons, safety, as a
Right.
critical one at our company. But economy, efficiency, productivity, a lot of those things, which contractor we might be working for, that there's reasons why. And as long as we have a why, we can feel pretty good about why we made that decision.
Yeah, you have a reason for it. So you mentioned culture meeting. That's not a type of meeting I hear a lot about. What is a culture meeting?
Well, a few years ago, we embarked on a plan to define Dawood's culture.
Hmm.
And I think it's really easy for people to confuse what our values are uh, versus what define those behaviors. So, I'll say traditional values, um, without defining what those actions are, people will define for themselves what those actions would mean. So myself and a group of people helped me at the company, and we came up with 24 fundamental habits. And some of those things, they're very, I'll say, I don't, basic's not the right word, but simple. Like when you hear them, you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. But without saying them out loud, I think saying them out loud, putting them in writing, we actually have a little pamphlet that we give to all employees and all new employees that I think having that information written down, it confirms our expectations of what we want out of our staff from everybody, top to bottom. Focus on clients, right? Obvious, right? That's who pays our bills, and we sometimes we need to listen to what they want, not what we want to do. Always respect others, right? It seems very straightforward, and you would expect that, but that's not always the case.
Hmm.
Egos can get involved in certain companies, and people have, we're not asking everybody to be best friends, but we have to
Hmm.
treat everyone with respect to have a company that works and we're all going towards the same direction,
Yeah.
and we're efficient and we're safe and all of those things. Continuously improve is another one that always comes up. And that kind of goes back to, why are we doing something? And that can change over time.
Mm.
and that goes through continuous improvement.
Right, right. It's
And
funny when you
that's,
say,
some people,
yeah.
different people have different ideas and they say, hey, why do we do this? And we
Mhm.
give that reason and they say, well, if you did it this way, would it be better because X, Y, Z? That's exactly what I'm talking about with, I don't want to hear
Right,
this is the way
right,
we've always done it. It may have been the way we've done it for this reason. If there's a better way to do it, we should definitely investigate that.
right. So it almost sounds like you're giving people permission to engage in the behaviors that you want to see that are going to make your company better.
Uh, I don't, I understand what you're saying. I wouldn't necessarily classify it as permission. I think these are, I'll say, typical human traits.
Okay, okay.
Um,
But some are
it
hard,
just,
right? Like if
they are not
respect
hard. They're,
is telling somebody something they don't want to hear, that could be difficult, right? And we may shy away from that.
you're
Uh,
absolutely right. But I think, when you put all of these together, doing the right thing, right? Being
mhm.
accountable,
Yeah,
uh, being responsive, honor commitments.
yeah,
Sometimes if you have to call somebody out on not honoring a commitment, it relates to doing the right thing.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So they're
So
tying together. Yeah.
so I hear what you're saying. I think the idea obviously is to make everyone aware of, you're right, these are things that you would expect in your daily life, and but saying this is what we expect in your work life as well.
Right, right. So if a leader wanted to follow your lead here and do something like this, what were some of the first steps that you took to go down this path?
Well, I listened to a great uh, informational session through Vistage.
Okay.
Um, there's a lot of information that you can develop. And I would say, the habits aren't necessarily something that tie directly to your core values. They can,
Hmm.
but it was recommended that they not. So I think, for us in an engineering firm where we do a lot of work in the field and a lot of work in the office, and we're in multiple states and
Yeah.
countries, I think the idea is coming up with what is most important to you,
Mm.
right? What
Yeah.
is most important to your company's success, and
Hmm.
thinking about all of the ways that are needed. And I'll say this is one area that I've grown into, thinking back to when I first started my career, if you would have told me, well, the people are the most important part of a company back when I first joined, I was like, well, it didn't feel like that as being one of those people.
Ah, yeah, yeah.
Now, on the leadership side, I can definitely see, we've been shorthanded for a long time too. Hiring engineers has been very challenging.
Hmm.
The people are the most important side, important part of the company. So that's, why culture, having a good culture is so critical. Uh, we want the people, we want the
Right.
right people, and we want people that are going to espouse these defining habits.
Yeah. It's a differentiator then when you have it
Absolutely.
and it brings the right people in. Yeah. Outstanding. So it's interesting you say it's individualized. So one company just couldn't pick up, the behaviors that you've identified are important at Dawood and say, oh, these are ours, right? So it's going to be individualized to each company about what makes them successful. I think that's a really interesting takeaway and important point that you made. Okay. What I'm curious, you talked a little bit about where you were, what you've learned. I asked this question a couple times and I'm always really intrigued by the answer. What is an undervalued skill that you think leaders should focus on?
I had mentioned communication
Mm.
earlier, and I think the important part of that is understanding that not everybody communicates the same way. If you
Mm.
can understand as a leader that the way you communicate is different than the way your 20-year-old intern communicates versus the way your CEO might communicate, everyone, it's like personality.
Yeah,
Communication itself is like a personality. Everyone has a different one.
yeah.
And knowing that we all might communicate differently, and I'm going to tie this back to culture. Uh, if you can assume positive intent,
Hmm.
I think that's going to be critical with communication, because I think sometimes people can say things and it sounds differently. I have a really good example of that. We had our Tuesday meeting where we're talking about go, no go on projects, and a comment was made about down staff. And another individual on that call took that to mean downsize.
Oh,
And that was not the case at all. It just so happened that we're going to have three individuals out on maternity at the same time, or two on maternity, and maybe one is being called up for military. So literally, we're going to be down three individuals from a staffing perspective. But because of communication and because of our relationship, she just said, "Hey, can I talk to you about something?" And we had this discussion on people communicate differently. She felt more comfortable talking to me about it than the individual that said it, and that's fine. But that goes to, communication and relationships. But understanding that people talk or say things like to the individual that said it, the way he said it, it was perfectly clear to
right,
him that he was going
right.
to be down staff. But the
Yeah.
way other people heard that was different. And then with her assuming positive intent, right? She asked for clarification before thinking, oh, the sky is falling. We're going to lay off, 50 people and I need to find a new job. So
Yeah.
it kind of averted a catastrophe. She just came and asked for clarification. We got it
Yeah.
cleared, and
Cleared
we
up.
had the communication discussion of, listen, like people, it might sound very clear to me, and I'm guilty of this too. I
Right.
speak and engineers speak frequently in the message group meeting, forgetting that not everybody in that group is an
Some
engineer.
glazed eyes start showing up. Yeah. Well, I think it's great to remember that in your story is an excellent point. It's like, the message is evaluated at the listener's ears and not at the speaker's mouth. And we always have to be checking for that validation of, tell me what that just sounded like, or could you let me know how that came across? Because it sounds one way in my head, but it might sound a completely different way coming out of my mouth. And I think that's a great, great story to sort of edify that. Yeah. So you mentioned maternity leave, and I worked for somebody who said, babies are an excellent measure of a healthy culture. That, a healthy company where people feel comfortable to have families, right? So I know you're a father, you've got a family. Tell me about that struggle or that success in balancing work, family, priorities with kids, things like that. I mean, that is something so relatable to many listeners.
This is another discussion I had recently, and I'm going to use this as a plug for Dawood Engineering. Dawood's the reason that I chose, like the flexibility I have at Dawood is the reason
Mm-hmm.
I chose coming here. One of the places I interviewed, it was like you work 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. with an hour lunch. I'm like, wow, that's going to be really tough to make, any
Soccer
child,
games or
yeah, soccer
anything.
games
Yeah.
or school, anything.
Mm-hmm.
Um, two kids, travel soccer year round, swimming, you name it, variety of clubs. I get to attend as much as I want. I've got the flexibility here, and I say this to my entire team. I don't want you to miss anything for
Right.
your children or your family. We have a really flexible PTO, and this is another thing that came up with in our culture discussion that the flexibility, the reason I chose Dawood, because of the flexibility, I can either choose, to take time off or I can work later. So uh,
Mhm.
like last week, I had something for my youngest daughter, took her to her event in the middle of the day, and
Okay.
then I came back and I worked later, and I still got, the time I needed to get in to complete my work.
Right.
Same thing, and then other times I could just take the time off.
Yeah.
I have volunteered for every one of my children's school field trips, so I've chaperoned a lot
Mm-hmm.
in the 16 years of my oldest daughter. Um, but critically important to me to be there. Family is, number one for a lot of people. Family is number one for me. I think when I filled out the guide to this podcast, it was like, what are your other hobbies? So golf is another big hobby. So again, I can look out and say, oh, the sun is shining.
Very nice day out.
I better get out there. Better go get a tea time before it starts raining, and then still come back and finish my work later.
Right.
So there's a lot of flexibility here. So to go back to your original question, how to balance all of that. It is challenging.
Right.
And that's kind of separate from having a workplace that provides you flexibility to do all of those things is very helpful.
Hmm.
Uh, but obviously, with like on a project, having some type of loose schedule, prioritizing. I use my calendar extensively because there are a lot of things, and you try not to forget
Yeah.
anything, and you need to plan, and having reminders obviously are all helpful. Um, the flexibility though is the flexibility to do those things
Yeah.
and set your priority is really helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. I was working with another leader and she can't get to everything, and to your point, I think it's great to get to as many things as possible. And she shared this great conversation she had, and her kids were a little bit younger than yours, maybe 7 and 10 or something. And she said, look, mommy can't get to everything. Give me the non-negotiables. Right. So she engaged them in the conversation, said, tell me the things that like you're okay if I'm not there, but give me the ones that you want me to be there. And then those were the non-negotiables, even, to the president of her company or to whatever, she made it. And so I just love the fact that like maybe I can't get to everything, but engage, your kids in the conversation of tell me what's important to you, because I might think it's the class party and to you it's the soccer game or the whatever. And so I just thought that was a really great sort of way to engage them in the conversation.
I like that idea.
Yeah.
Might have to steal that and implement
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. Well, that's why I shared it because I was like, wow, I never thought of that. That's really clever. I love that. That's excellent. Well, tell me this. We forget if it was Aristotle or Einstein said failure is our greatest teacher. What is your greatest mistake as a leader, and what did you learn from it?
I think, this is a really tough question. But we went through that personality profile, and me and one other individual in our group came out as perfectionists. So
Mhm.
that feels like every mistake is my biggest failure as a perfectionist. But I know
Podcast
that's
isn't
not
that
the
long, Nick.
intent of this question. I think the biggest failure I've made was settling, honestly. If you settle on an individual that has red flags because you're desperate,
Mm-hmm, hmm.
you can end up doing more damage than positive. That I don't know if that's my biggest failure, but that ranks up there because it did cause some damage, both financially to the company. It caused some morale issues. When not everybody, I had mentioned before, it's a team, right? So
Yeah.
the other team members see that there's an individual that I don't say is getting away with anything because as a leader, you can't necessarily talk about
Hmm.
HR issues if somebody's on a
Sure.
performance improvement plan or not. Um, but that is a challenge. We're better off being underhanded and asking people to chip in. I'll say the flip side of that is having been through that, the other team members now know like, hey, I don't want to settle and have that situation again. If
Right.
we can all pitch in a little bit until I can
Hmm.
find, a candidate that is going to be a great addition,
Right.
everybody's a lot more understanding
Because
now.
because they lived through it, right? Like
we
it
we
is.
failed that together. Unfortunately, it was my
Yes.
decision, and everybody suffered the consequences.
Right. Right. It is a lesson I think leaders almost have to learn the hard way. You can tell a leader like, look, it is probably better to go without than to go with wrong. And that empty spot sometimes is so tempting to fill, even with somebody that's not right. And I think until you've lived through exactly what you're saying, they don't quite get it. But what's our favorite saying, right? You encourage what you tolerate, or what you tolerate, you
Absolutely.
encourage, or whichever way you want to say it. So, excellent lesson, I think, for leaders. Well, Nick, I think this has been as close to magic as I'm going to get today. This has been a fabulous conversation. I really appreciate your time. and your insights. I think you've shared some amazing things that really stuck out for our listeners. And I want to highlight just a couple at the end here, just to really highlight them. First, I really loved what you had to say about compartmentalizing inside of your company and inside of your teams. You really, you're talking about building a bridge, but I think the lesson goes beyond that. And the idea that you want to default to, look, just let everyone know, right? Even if you don't think they need to know, just let everyone know. I think that default of communication really can prevent errors and prevent compartmentalization, like you said. So I love that. That's number one. Number two is your communication. Though the lesson learned through your communication is that one size doesn't fit all, and that it's really a nuanced thing. And the highlight I took really was that assuming a positive intent on the part of the listener is that critical piece for success. So that 20-year-old, that 50-year-old, that 70-year-old, right? They're all going to communicate in different ways. And you, as that listener, you have to say, that's probably not what they meant. Let me go and find out. Right. So I just really love that. And lastly, you have put in place, I don't think you gave yourself justice, just, knowing a little bit more about what you've done at Dawood related to the culture work and the behaviors that you've defined and the impact that you've made there. But you did give listeners some actions there about, look, define the behaviors that exemplify your culture, and they are idiosyncratic to you, right? You can't just pick up somebody else's playbook and think it's going to work at your company. So you have to really look inside and start there. That's really what I want to highlight. I think you've offered leaders something to lead well in their companies. Sharing what you have about how you live well and focusing on your kids is really awesome. And learn well. You've really shared a lot about how you've grown as a leader across your years, both before Dawood and certainly with Dawood. So I want to thank you for that. And just offer an opportunity. How can people follow up with you, learn more about Dawood?
Sure. Thanks, Kirsten, for having me. We are on the internet, of course, www.dawood.net. I'm on LinkedIn. My email is nicholas.brien@dawood.net. Feel free to reach out.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nick. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks.
Thank you for joining me today for another great hustle conversation with a Central PA executive. You can find out more about my guest in the show notes. And if you liked the episode or have something to add to our conversation, please find me on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Subscribe, rate, and review. Remember, leadership is best practiced in community. You know a leader who needs to hear something from this episode. So pay it forward and send it to them today. Don't wait. Until next time, the best leaders not only lead well, they live well and learn well. Bye now.